Have you ever stopped to think that the entire history of humanity can be summed up as the journey of one fragile species? No claws, no fangs, no great speed, that somehow managed to dominate the entire planet? Because the truth is, humans didn't start at the top. Not even close. We started small, vulnerable, surrounded by predators, and completely dependent on nature. And yet, somehow, we left the African savannas, crossed continents, built empires, invented gods, money, wars, cities, machines, the internet, and reached a point where we're debating the future of artificial intelligence and life beyond Earth. But the most fascinating part is this. Human history isn't just a timeline of dates. It's a collection of unlikely accidents, brilliant discoveries, massive mistakes, and turning points that changed everything. And today I want to take you through that entire journey in a fast, clear, and fascinating way so you can understand how humanity went from almost nothing to everything we know today. When we hear the history of humanity, it sounds huge, heavy, and distant. It sounds like something from a history textbook, like a bunch of hard-to-remember names, ancient wars, and events that have nothing to do with us. But they do. Because the history of humanity is, at its core, the story of how you got here. It's the story of every discovery that shaped the world you live in. It's the story of how our ancestors learned to walk, hunt, farm, build, write, believe, fight, think, and transform the earth. And what's most incredible is realizing that almost everything we see as normal today was once an outrageous revolution. There was a time when making fire felt almost like magic. There was a time when writing was a privilege reserved for a few. There was a time when crossing an ocean meant stepping into the unknown. And there was a time when no one could even imagine speaking to someone on the other side of the planet in seconds. So stick around until the end, because you're about to see how humanity evolved, stumbled, grew, reinvented itself again and again. And why maybe the most important part of this story is still happening right now. The beginning of everything. The history of humanity begins in Africa, where the earliest ancestors of our lineage emerged. And here's an interesting detail right away. Human beings didn't just appear out of nowhere, fully formed. Evolution was slow, full of gradual changes. One of the first major steps was bipedalism, walking on two legs. It sounds simple, but it changed everything. Walking upright freed the hands, made it easier to carry objects, helped with long-distance movement, and opened the door to other transformations. Over time, species like the Australopithecines appeared, followed by the first members of the genus Homo. And these beings began doing something decisive, using simple tools, sharp stones, branches, improvised objects. They weren't sophisticated inventions, but they were the beginning of a pattern that would define humanity forever. The ability to change the environment in order to survive better. The first humans and the fight for survival. Early humans lived in extremely harsh conditions. Life was basically a daily battle against hunger, cold, predators, and the dangers of nature. But it was exactly in that brutal environment that the skills that brought us here began to develop. Humans started cooperating more, hunting in groups, sharing food, protecting one another, teaching the young. That cooperation became one of our species' greatest weapons. And that's fascinating because physically, humans were not the most impressive animals in nature. We weren't the strongest, we weren't the fastest, but we had one advantage. We could learn, remember, and pass knowledge on. Each generation didn't have to start from scratch. The mastery of fire. At some point in prehistory, humans learned how to control fire, and this may have been one of the most important turning points in all of history. Fire brought warmth, protection from animals, light at night, and the possibility of cooking food. And cooking wasn't just about taste. Cooked food is easier to chew, digest, and absorb. That helped the body spend less energy on digestion and supported the development of the brain over time. On top of that, fire brought people together. Can you imagine the impact of that? For the first time, human groups could gather at night, tell stories, observe one another, build bonds, and strengthen language. A campfire didn't just push back the darkness, it helped create community, the rise of Homo sapiens. After many evolutionary branches, Homo sapiens appeared, our species. But here's something many people don't know. For a period of time, Homo sapiens were not alone on the planet. Other humans existed, like the Neanderthals. In other words, there was a time when different human species coexisted. Human history was not a straight line. It was full of detours, encounters, disappearances, and unexpected changes. Homo sapiens eventually became the dominant surviving human species, and one reason seems to have been our enormous ability to adapt. We managed to live in different environments, change strategies, create solutions, and above all, cooperate in larger and larger groups. The cognitive revolution. If fire changed survival, the human mind changed the destiny of our species. At some point, humans began developing much more complex language, not just useful sounds for hunting or warning others of danger, but symbols, narratives, memories, and abstract ideas. This may be the point where humanity truly began to become humanity, because from that moment on, humans were no longer living only in the immediate present. They could imagine, they could plan, they could invent stories, they could create shared beliefs. And that was decisive. Entire groups began organizing around myths, traditions, leaders, ancestors, and symbols. Cave art, for example, shows that humans were already thinking abstractly, already trying to record something, already feeling the need to leave a mark. The human mind had taken a leap. The expansion across the planet. With that ability to adapt, Homo sapiens began spreading across the planet. They left Africa and gradually occupied different regions of the world: Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. This expansion is one of the greatest adventures in human history. Because we're not talking about a civilization with maps and engines. We're talking about groups crossing unknown landscapes, facing extreme climates, encountering new animals, new challenges, and having to survive in completely different territories. Curiosity, exploration, and adaptation have always been at the center of humanity. Maybe that's why our history never stopped moving forward. The agricultural revolution. For a very long time, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. But around 10,000 years ago, a massive change began: agriculture. Instead of only searching for food in nature, humans began producing food. They started planting crops and domesticating animals. This changed absolutely everything. From that point on, human groups could settle in one place. Villages appeared, then cities, then increasingly complex societies. But the agricultural revolution brought a strange contradiction. It helped humanity grow, but it also created new problems. Once there was surplus production, accumulation began. And where there is accumulation, inequality follows. Some people began to have more land, more resources, more power. Conflicts over territory also became more common, along with disputes over production and the spread of disease, since many people were now living closer together. In other words, agriculture didn't bring only comfort, it also brought tension, the first inventions that organized the world. As villages grew and societies became more complex, humanity needed to invent tools to organize life itself. The wheel was one of those major inventions. It made transportation, movement, and many practical tasks much easier. But perhaps one of the most impactful inventions was writing. And here's a fascinating detail. Writing did not first appear so people could tell beautiful stories. It was strongly connected to administration. It was used to record taxes, supplies, exchanges, harvests, and the organization of power. In other words, before writing became literature, it was control, and that allowed civilizations to become much more organized. The birth of cities, states, and hierarchies. With surplus food, writing, religion, trade, and division of labor, the first cities and states emerged. Temples, laws, armies, governments, and hierarchies became part of human life. Society became more structured, but also more unequal. Some gave orders, others obeyed. Some owned land, others worked to maintain the system. At the same time, cities became centers of culture, politics, and religion. It was in this context that great ancient civilizations were born, such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and others. And with them came some of history's greatest legacies: philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law, literature, and more sophisticated forms of social organization. Bronze, iron, and power. At a certain point, humanity became increasingly skilled at working with metals. First bronze, then iron. That may sound like a technical detail, but it completely transformed societies. Better tools increased production. Better weapons increased military power. Better construction strengthened cities and empires. Metal technology helped create stronger kingdoms and more destructive wars. Once again, human history showed a pattern that would repeat many times. Almost every great invention could be used both to build and to dominate. The Middle Ages and changes beyond Europe. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered a period of political fragmentation, feudalism, and strong religious influence. It was a time of wars, instability, and deep inequality. The bubonic plague, for example, devastated entire populations and changed the structure of European society. But it's important to remember something. The world was not standing still. While Europe faced many crises, other regions were advancing significantly. The Islamic world stood out in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and the preservation of many ancient texts and ideas. China developed inventions that would later impact the entire world. In other words, human history never happened in just one place. It has always been multiple stories happening at once. The Renaissance, exploration, and science. With the Renaissance, interest in art, knowledge, and the observation of nature gained new strength in Europe. Human beings began to question more, investigate more, and look at the world with different eyes. Then came the great ocean voyages, and that changed global history. Oceans stopped being barriers and became pathways. Continents became more intensely connected. But that connection came with enormous violence. Colonization, slavery, economic exploitation, disease, and the destruction of entire peoples were all part of this process. Human history is fascinating, but it has never been clean. It is full of achievements and tragedies at the same time. During this same period, the printing press helped ideas spread much faster. Science began to develop a method. Observation, experimentation, and logic started to carry enormous weight. Humanity was entering a new phase. Revolutions and the industrial world. Then came the Enlightenment, political revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution. Ideas of liberty, equality, and criticism of traditional power began shaking the world. At the same time, machines transformed work, cities, and the pace of life. Production became much faster. Cities grew. Modern capitalism gained strength. Human life accelerated. On one hand, this brought material progress and new possibilities. On the other, it created exhausting workdays, labor exploitation, urban poverty, and massive inequality. Once again, humanity was moving forward, but paying a high price. The 20th century, destruction and invention. The 20th century may have been one of the most contradictory periods in all of history. On one side, there were world wars, genocides, the atomic bomb, and levels of destruction never seen before. On the other, there were astonishing advances in medicine, aviation, communication, film, computing, and space exploration. It's almost unbelievable to think that the same species that created antibiotics and sent humans into space was also capable of such brutal wars. The 20th century made one thing very clear, something that had always been present in human history. Our power grew much faster than our wisdom. the digital age and today's crises. In recent decades, humanity entered the digital age. Computers, the internet, smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence began shaping everyday life. Today, we live connected all the time. Information moves at an absurd speed. The world has become more connected, but also faster, more anxious, and more complex. At the same time, major dilemmas have emerged: climate change, inequality, pandemics, technology ethics, information manipulation, and mental health. Perhaps for the first time so clearly, humans have realized that we now have real power to alter the planet on a global scale. And that changes everything. The future of humanity. And that brings us to the most important question. What comes next? The history of humanity is not over. In fact, we may be entering one of its most decisive chapters. We talk about space colonization, biotechnology, the merging of humans and machines, increasingly advanced artificial intelligence, and new ways of living in society. But deep down, the central question is still the same as always. Will humanity be able to use its power wisely? Because technology has never been our only challenge. The greatest challenge has always been human. In the end, the history of humanity is the story of an unlikely species, a species that began fragile, lost, and surrounded by limits, but learned to imagine, create, destroy, rebuild, and transform the world. We went from stone tools to satellites, from campfires to microchips, from caves to megacities. And even after all of that, we're still trying to answer the same essential questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? And where are we going? Maybe that's the greatest mystery of all. Humanity conquered the planet, but it is still trying to understand itself. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because there are still so many historical curiosities and fascinating mysteries for us to explore together.